to swallow us all. Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder.
Today we'll be reviewing another hand coming from solveforwhy's Poker Out Loud series. But before we get into the hand analysis, I want to clarify that the hands from this series were played back in 2017, so they may not be reflective of current strategies. However, the point in my prior video wasn't to specifically critique Berkey or solveforwhy, since I don't know their overall philosophy, and you can't really judge a system or a player by a single hand. That being said, it seems that a larger debate has been raised from these videos. Matt has, on more than one occasion, described poker as chaos, and in many ways he's right. The critical question, though, is how should one deal with this chaos? One can embrace and even heighten the chaos, as it seems a number of players in this series attempt to do, by deliberately choosing unconventional lines, elevating the stakes, and then seizing the initiative to leverage the resulting chaos against the opponent. However, another approach is to manage and attempt to bring order to that chaos, which in essence is what GTO is designed to accomplish. Right, GTO mathematically calculates an unexploitable strategy that is driven in large part by probabilities. So with certain assumptions in place, we can quantify exactly what percentage of the time the solver is using a certain strategy, and we can measure how much EV we're losing by taking a particular line, which at least brings some degree of clarity to the chaos.
Okay, this is one of our favorite hands. Gonna start with an open here. Wouldn't mind even if I'm 3-bet, I can defend very easily.
$200 deep, I'm gonna play around here with Matt.
All right, we have a pretty weak hand here with 9-4 spades, but it's like, you know, we're hood as fuck, so I'm calling.
So Matt opens it up in the hijack with Queen Jack suited, which is a standard open, though the sizing is on the larger side, and then Nick calls on the button with 10-7 off, and Christian overcalls in the big blind with 9-4 suited. Apparently the solver is not hood at all, because it is folding both of these hands with no ante in play, as these types of low equity holdings will often find themselves in very difficult spots post-flop. And this appears to be a bit of a repeated pattern in this series, where a player first identifies what the quote-unquote correct play is, which usually is a fold, and then he deliberately does the opposite with either a call or raise. So I'm not sure if they're taking these lines purely for the sake of creating content, or if these strategies are intended to disguise their play, to counter-exploit, or to stoke the chaos. But in any event, I do think these spots are interesting to analyze from a GTO perspective, because much of the general population, depending on the stakes, will play holdings like these. So to set up the sim for this hand, we're going to treat Matt as the control GTO subject, and give him a standard hijack opening range, and we'll be giving both Christian and Nick a big blind calling range after a small blind raise, which includes a small percentage of their particular holdings at the bottom of the range.
All right, so we flopped a decent amount of equity here. Bottom pair, no backdoor flush draw. We're actually just gonna lead here and kind of leverage Berkey here in the middle. And he's probably gonna respond with a raise a decent amount of time, but we don't care, we only have bottom pair, so it doesn't matter.
So for this sim, we'll be testing out a new product by Simple Poker, the makers of Simple Postflop. This product, Simple 3-Way, estimates GTO strategies for games involving 3 players, and although I haven't fully tested it yet, it works surprisingly quickly and is relatively easy and intuitive to use. So as you can probably guess, the solver is not leading at all in this spot, and this is the case whether we are multi-way or heads up. According to GTO, there are much better boards to lead on. For example, if we take a look at a hijack versus big blind scenario across 184 different flops, we see that the solver doesn't donk much at all, but when it does, usually it's on these lower connected boards where the big blind has the advantage in straights. However, if we filter by queen high boards, we see that the solver is doing virtually no donking. Likely in large part because if we assume the big blind has no pocket queens, it is impossible for him to have the nuts on most of these flops, and therefore leading opens up the possibility of being punished by the hijack with impunity. However, it appears that Christian decides to leverage the multi-way dynamic by taking a stab with his bottom pair without the backdoor flush draw, which he seems to imply he's okay giving up with if raised.
So this is a really easy spot. It kind of monkey wrenched what my plan was. Nick's been playing quite volatile, and this board texture should nail his flattening range. He's gonna have a lot of 6-7 suited, 7-8 suited, 5-6 suited, some suited aces with backdoors. Basically a lot of available equity for him to have c-bet, 9s, 8s, 7s, things that he wasn't really gonna check back when check to that I would be able to get in a very layup check raise against. With Christian leading now, we have very little concerns. Sure, he has pocket 5s and 4s. He also has 5-4, maybe even the offsuit combinations. With that being said, given my backdoor equity, I'm considering a raise here. I don't really think anything bad can happen. But along the same lines, if I just flat, yeah, I don't like it as much because I can't raise really on the 3 of hearts, 4 of hearts, 6 of hearts, 7 of hearts, or 8 of hearts. And those are really important cards for me to be able to press my equity with. I don't want to just shift to realization. So I'm gonna go ahead and continue here through a raise, treating this as just being top of range.
Matt decides to raise with his top pair, 3.3x Christian's bet, and we see that the solver is indeed punishing this lead quite often, including with a significant portion of its queen-jack holdings. Given that the out-of-position preflop caller has initiated the action and signaled that it has equity on this board, we see that all of the hijack sets, a majority of its 2 pairs, and a good portion of its overpairs, top pairs, and draws are raising in this spot. Comparing this to the solution for a two-handed game, we see that the solver is even more aggressive in Matt's shoes, raising around 27% of its range against the donk, which makes sense given that the hijack should proceed with a bit more caution when playing multi-way out of position, and we see that the solver is defending much less frequently overall in the multi-way game.
Couple of interesting things going on here. I really don't think Chin leads out big. He's got a pretty wide range peeling from the big blind, and he's got 2 aggressive players behind him that are probably going to be stabbing pretty often at this spot. At the same time, I really don't think Matt raises strong with me behind him and probably perceiving Chin weak, so I actually think they're both relatively weak, and I'm going to try to pull off a pretty insane maneuver, which is to basically float naked, and I think it's a spot not a lot of players would be able to balance bluffs, and for that reason, I think my range construction is going to be quite effective for what I'm trying to do, at least my perceived range construction. So I'm just going to flat.
Nick calls, and not surprisingly, the solver is folding here. I'm not going to belabor the point, as clearly this is a deliberate deviation from the quote-unquote correct strategy. However, I think it's worth noting that making a significant exploitative adjustment like this to counter your opponent's imbalances runs the risk of effectively engaging in a race to the bottom, where you can end up leveling yourself into making plays that are diametrically opposed to conventional strategies. Right, while ordinarily a lead and a raise would appear to be quite strong, Nick, presumably based on past history, assumes their lines convey weakness, and therefore he adjusts by playing wider as well. Now again, this is not to say that this type of max exploitative line can't be profitable as part of a larger systematic model. It very well could be. But while choosing unconventional lines can be effective to counteract imbalanced players and disguise your overall strategy, usually standard plays are standard for a reason, and therefore intentionally deviating from them in a substantial way carries with it significant risk.
Alright, whatever evil intentions we may have had have just been fucked. So even though I think Berkey can have a decent amount of bluffs here, like ace, king, jack 10, etc., with all those backdoors, when Nick calls here, it's going to be pretty strong, and we only have bottom pair. And even though I may have had a little evil intention. I'm just gonna fold.
Next cold call here is very devious. I think he's still really wide with his floats, and that is my gin card. This is going to appear to give him range advantage and should shut down my hands, like if I have kings, aces, ace, queen plus, etc. He's rather free now to take a hand like 7-8, 7-6. He could have 4-6 of hearts. He could have ace-4 of hearts for the nut flush draw. And then his weaker floats, like, I guess like 8-9 of diamonds, 8-9 of clubs, 7-8 of clubs, etc., etc., etc. They just don't have enough showdown value, so this card kind of sets him up for a 2-barrel. I'm certainly going to start with a check, and depending on if he overbets or not, I'll be check calling 2 or just check smashing through.
The turn is the 7 of hearts, and Berkey checks, recognizing that this card gives Nick's pre-flop flatting range to the theoretical advantage, with the goal of ultimately inducing a bet. And we see that this check is consistent with the solver strategy that continues betting with its strongest hands and some draws, but is primarily checking its top pair holdings even with the flush draw. And it is quite common for the solver to play more passively when out of position and deeper stacked, as it will oftentimes shift into bluff catching mode even with relatively strong holdings.
Matt's checking here. I think I'm just gonna bet pretty small. Basically, if his range is containing showdown-driven hands and air, with maybe a few nut hands sprinkled in, I really don't think I have to risk more than less than a half pot size bet here. I'm in a position where I can always size up river to maximize, and I just feel like the right sizing for a spot where he may be relatively imbalanced by just giving up is just a cheap bet. So I'm just gonna bet 300.
Nick makes a 39% pot bet, and we do see that the solver is betting over half its range on this turn card, which is generally more favorable to the preflop caller, even with the wider range we've given Nick for this sim. Specifically, we see that the solver is betting Nick's gut shot with significant frequency, particularly when holding a heart, as it gives Nick a faux flush draw, which is a great candidate to barrel with on a heart river as a bluff with the flush blocker. Given Berkey's check, Nick identifies Berkey's range as consisting primarily of showdown hands, air, and some nuttish hands sprinkled in, though he doesn't specifically reference medium-strength hands. Against that perceived range, Nick opts to leverage the board and bet on the smallest side, which should cause a significant chunk of the weaker portion of Berkey's range to fold, while at the same time doesn't risk significant capital against a possible slow-played monster.
So I really like the sizing that he chose. It seems to be an induction size where I think he thinks I would fall for this with one pair type holdings, and he can take a cheap stab at it with a lot of his range. Now, here's the thing, with that bet in my call, there's gonna be about 1,400 in the pot, and I'm gonna have 1,600 or 1,700 behind, so about pot. The clarity on the river is actually insanely poor. So it's really difficult for me to go call on a 6, 7, 8, or 3. I don't really think he's necessarily going to bluff a 10, jack, queen, king, or ace. Also, the ace could fulfill some of his hands like ace 6 of hearts, ace 4 of hearts. So I'm actually going to check raise. I'm definitely going to check raise. I'm just trying to determine if I'm shoving or making it more of a bluff heavy size. So I think if I make it 750 here with 1,200 behind, he'll think he has fold equity with both his equitable hands and his nothingness. And I just realized I'm actually deeper than I thought. So I actually have like 2,700 here. So I'm gonna make a more standard check raise size to 1,000.
Berkey decides to raise 3x Nick's bet, and we see that the solver will raise with this holding with minimal frequency, but that it generally prefers checking. On the one hand, top pair is likely ahead of most of Nick's range, and can also benefit from protection against the numerous draws that Nick should have on this board. But on the other hand, the possibility of a number of straights, sets, two pairs, and stronger top pairs in Nick's range should dampen the aggression for Matt's top pair. That being said, the additional equity provided by Matt's flush draw serves as a backup safety net in the scenario that he's behind, so we see that a raise is not losing huge amounts of EV to checking. And so Matt decides to raise for a couple of articulated reasons. For one, although he believes that there is a good chance Nick is bluffing, he expresses a concern about not having clarity on the river if he shifts into check call mode, since he would be put in a very difficult spot if he were to face a large river bet. And this is true, right? If Nick decided to make a pot-sized bet on the river on many different runouts that do not contain a heart, from a GTO perspective, Matt would need to fold a number of his top pairs with the marginal kicker, especially since he would be blocking Nick's flush draw bluffs. Berkey also takes into account the fact that Nick may shut down in position on various river runouts that favor the preflop aggressor's range, thus perhaps causing Matt to lose value by simply calling here. From a GTO standpoint, this latter argument may be less compelling because top pair, weak kicker out of position on a disadvantageous board generally shouldn't be very incentivized to seek three streets of value when deep stacked, especially after a bet, raise, and cold call on the flop. That being said, ultimately Matt decides to raise and chooses a sizing that he believes may induce a shove by leaving behind a sufficient number of chips to afford Nick fold equity. This is an interesting line of logic, as from a GTO perspective, a common approach when facing a perceived bluff is to simply allow the villain to continue to bet and to bluff catch despite the inevitable uncertainty or chaos that may ensue.
I think Matt's check raise makes very little sense without a very tight range of hands. I did pick up a gutter. By betting small, I sort of opened myself up to this. It started out as an insane maneuver to begin with, and versus one of the only players at the table who I think is capable of playing a check raise bluff range here, I think it's just time to ship it in and go to bed. If Matt wakes up with a set here, more power to him. I think it's a really unorthodox, unconventional way for him to play a set, and he deserves to get paid if he did do that. I think it's a very strange way to play an overpair with the type of range that I'm required to felt at point of all-in with how this action went. The ranges are pretty tight. I think raising an overpair would be an overplay unless he thought I was about to do something that I'm about to do, so I'm all in.
Players all in.
All in.
Nick decides to shove with the gut shot as he perceives Matt as very polarized, and therefore he attempts to attack the bluffs at the bottom of Berkey's range, which he believes to be excessive. However, it seems that Nick underestimates the proportion of value to bluffs in Matt's range, as he mentions that it would be odd for Matt to play a hand like an overpair in this manner. While this may be true for the most part, I think this highlights one of the potential risks of utilizing a predominantly exploitative strategy, where you essentially are making decisions against a perceived node-locked range of villain, which in turn creates potential exposures in your own strategy. Right? In contrast, if you played this hand from a purely GTO standpoint, you would assume that villain's range is comprised of a perfect balance of a spectrum of possible hands, which in an abstracted way forces you to play against and be prepared for the worst case scenario. Right? Even though in reality no one plays a perfect GTO range, creating a fiction and assuming that villain has a reasonable proportion of bluffs, medium strength, and nuttish hands in its range compels the hero to account and create counter strategies for most of the possible equity profiles he may be facing, even if the exact combos assumed aren't accurate to reality. And while this mode of GTO thinking may end up leaving some money on the table in certain spots, the benefit is that it tends to mitigate risk and elevate the floor for loss in the long run.
All in.
Call.
Call.
Wow.
Got him.
I'd be really interested to hear if Matt was check raising there to induce. If that was what he was thinking, I think it's a really badass level. The main reason that I'm shipping is because I'm operating on the assumption that he's very polarized in that spot, which combinatorically narrows his value range a ton and could create a bluffing imbalance if he's not very careful. as soon as he starts doing something like what he just did, my play is pretty awful, because by expanding value, he basically makes it way easier for him to defend versus a re-raise. So I think it's a really cool anticipation almost of something that I might be doing. I would be interested in hearing his commentary, because I just think it's a really complicated zone.
So the real key to that last hand was having a good idea of the profile of my opponent, and the fact that he would see Christian's lead as weak and my raise on the flop as relatively weak, allowing him to thus float in order to attempt to pick up equity, which he did. Recognizing that that's an advantageous card for his float range, and then setting up a check raise induction just allows him to pull the trigger with the bottom of his range, which is really profitable for us. In spite of the fact that, if I just call, he very well could be barreling off on the river as well. But like I said, there's lack of clarity on some of the river cards where I might be making mistakes. And the other thing is that he just may not fire off. He may actually just shut down, especially like on a river queen.
So in this video, we observed two sides of the exploitative coin. On the one hand, we saw that with a good read on your opponent, choosing unconventional lines can, at least in certain scenarios, be more profitable than a GTO-based strategy. On the other hand, we saw how a seemingly innocuous exploitative adjustment, such as calling a couple bets with a very low equity hand, can compound itself into a major loss, ultimately manifesting into the chaos theory in effect. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.